Where does our desire to write come from?
I think the desire to write is really the desire to evolve or by resolving an inner dilemma. And by dilemma, I mean, I really think that the purpose of story is to reveal a transformation. And a transformation really involves the resolution to a dilemma. And I think of a dilemma as a problem that can't be solved without creating a new problem. There's two ingredients to a dilemma: powerful desire and a false belief. Think about that for a second. You've got your protagonist. They've got this powerful desire, but they're also struggling with a false belief. So at the core of every story is a protagonist that wants something that's impossible to achieve based on their current approach or their current identity. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think the desire to write is really the desire to resolve our own dilemma. I'll give you some examples of dilemma. Let's say, for example, faith. The dilemma of faith is powerful desire would be, I want to believe. False belief would be, give me proof, then I'll believe. Success. Notice a powerful desire would be, I want ambition. I want to be successful. The false belief will be, I will be successful when I make $1 million or whatever it is. But what we want is always outside of ourselves. Success is something that happens outside of myself. Belief or faith is something that happens outside of myself. I need proof in order to believe. And so what makes story so powerful is that story really is about reframing our relationship to that powerful desire. In other words, true faith will only occur when we let go of our false belief that I require proof in order to believe. True success will only occur when I let go of my false belief that success is incumbent upon some outward or some external validation. And true success can only come from within. So as human beings, I believe our desire to write is really about our desire to understand ourselves in a deeper way.
Writing is the search for truth?
Okay, well, this goes back to what I was just saying about resolving a dilemma. So when you think about it, problems are solved, but dilemmas are resolved through a shift in perception. Problems don't make for interesting stories. Like, I'll give you an example. Let's say I get a flat tire. I call AAA. They fix my tire. Problem solved. Not an interesting story. But let's say I get a flat tire. I'm out in the desert, and the AAA guy drives 800 miles to save me, and I'm dying of thirst. And I discover that the AAA guy is the guy who is the man who's sleeping with my wife. Now I have a dilemma. I want to kill the man who's here to save my life. Now that could be an interesting story, this drive back to civilization. All right, so when you, wait a second, this is going, but your question was about the truth?
Well, yeah, writing is the search for truth. Is it my truth, or is it an existential truth of the world?
Well, what I'm getting at is that the truth is, the story begins with an idea of the truth. And by the end of the story, we've reframed our relationship to that idea of the truth. So the truth might, at the beginning of the story, might be, I've been betrayed. But that's not the truth. That's perhaps the fact, or that's my belief. But by the end of the story, the truth might be that that I have not been a good husband, and that and that by being humbled, I'm able to see something that I wasn't able to see at the beginning of the story.
Okay, or what if you thought the truth was that your wife was cheating on you, but in fact, that was her ne'er-do-well brother, and he needed money because he had a gambling problem, and she didn't want to tell you, and he's adopted, and no one ever told you about him in the family. And so the only thing that was bad was that your wife didn't tell you about a brother that they were ashamed of because it didn't fit the family sort of dynamics.
Okay, and so what's the
So
question?
you thought the truth was that your wife was cheating on you, but in
Gotcha.
fact, she was not being honest,
Right.
but it wasn't about that. It was the fact that she was concealing a family member. So it was a lie of omission.
I got it. And the reason she was doing that was she was trying to protect her brother.
Or she was also putting on airs. Maybe they felt shame. You know,
Right.
sometimes the black sheep of the family, quote unquote, brings shame. So the
Right.
family doesn't want to acknowledge that person.
I got you. So yeah. So are we exploring whether or not this would be a viable story?
Or we're out, the truth, we're going back to, because you were saying it's about truth. So in the sense, the truth was faulty in that because your wife wasn't actually being,
Oh, I see what you're talking.
she was not cheating on you.
I'm talking about universal truths. I'm not talking about the truth as opposed to a lie. I'm talking about a deeper understanding of oneself or the world. Do you follow? Like the
Okay.
truth that sets me free isn't that my wife confesses, "Oh, this was not a lover. This was my brother." The truth is about the theme. All right. So the truth might. So let's say the theme is intimacy. I want intimacy with my wife, but I suspect that there's a secret. There's some wall up, right? And so so the dilemma of intimacy, for example, might be powerful desire. I want intimacy, and the false belief. The false belief might be until my wife tells me the truth, I can never have intimacy with her. But here's the thing. There's probably a reason she's not telling me the truth that has nothing to do with her brother. It has to do with her fear that of whatever my response will be.
Sure.
Because if there's true intimacy, she would take the risk of telling me this family secret. Do you follow? So it's not that she's concealing the truth. It's why she's concealing the truth. Story is about a search for meaning.
Okay.
Okay. And every well-told story will want the story to build in meaning as it progresses. All right. Every page should be more interesting than the previous page because we're becoming more invested in the protagonist's dilemma. All right. So if the story was simply about why is she lying, or pardon me, if the story was just about she is lying, and I wonder if he's going to find the truth, that's the plot. The plot isn't going to get you to the end of the story. What's going to get us to the end of the story is by reframing our relationship to why she's lying. And so both characters are going to have to, if the guy is the protagonist, if the husband is the protagonist, he's going to have to in some way change or grow in order for him to understand what intimacy means. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So the plot is, will he find out the truth?
Right,
The theme is, will he reframe his relationship to what intimacy means? Will he in some way humble himself so that she is actually able to tell him the truth? And will the new sort of equilibrium, will the new relationship to each other survive this disclosure?
Interesting. Okay, so it's not about whether hiding a family member because she felt shame or she's sleeping with the pool boy. It's because of her relationship to being how you may see her, or you wanting to be a better husband, something like that.
Right. Here's the thing: is that if all that happens in the story is the protagonist gets what they want, our audience is going to be disappointed. What we care about is the protagonist getting what they need, and so we don't really ultimately care about what they want. If Jimmy Stewart leaves Bedford Falls at the end of It's a Wonderful Life, we're going to be disappointed. What we care about is that he reframes his relationship to what a wonderful life means.
Why is it important for writers to understand that the idea of the story is not the whole story?
Well, I do always say that to my writers, is that your idea of your story is never the whole story. It's not that the idea is incorrect. It's the idea is incomplete, all right? And so being a writer, being a story, being an artist is humbling because you're not the author, you're the channel. And so when I'm working with writers, I'm really speaking to their higher self. I'm talking, I really believe that your subconscious is the seat of your genius. And the genius is not a noun, it's a verb. It's something we all have access to. And so you have to let go of your idea of your story. You have to let go of your ego. Because as Einstein says, you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. Every story begins with an apparent dramatic problem, all right? But you can't solve it at the same level of consciousness that created it. So what you've got to do is you've got to let go of this idea of what the story is in order for the truth of the story to emerge. If I was to reduce or distill story structure to 3 words, I'd say it's desire. The protagonist has to want something. The stakes are life and death. If I don't get blank, my life will be unimaginable. If Jan Brady doesn't get a date with Tad Hamilton, she will positively die. All right? And then surrender. Your protagonist has to let go of the meaning they made out of their goal. All right? And then finally, transformation. So desire, surrender, transformation. I'm really a big believer in the 3-act structure. And so the first act is all about thesis. It's the argument. It's the dramatic question stated. Act 2 is about antithesis. It's the drama played out. And then Act 3 is synthesis or integration. How can we take these 2 seemingly disparate ideas and that collide and lead us to a deeper truth? So, these 2 seemingly disparate ideas involve the dilemma. So for example, justice. Justice would be powerful desire. I want justice. The false belief is that when I kill my enemy, justice will be done. By the end of the story, your protagonist reframes their relationship to what justice means. They might discover that true justice means discovering perhaps that I'm complicit in this thing. It might be a mystery story or a thriller where they discover that in their attempt to uncover justice, they discover something about their beloved that creates a dilemma where if I do kill my enemy, I will in some way be complicit in the crime.
Now you say that we are not the author or the channel. If we take something, let's say like Oppenheimer, amazing film, that's based on someone's life, how are we actually a channel when that life has already occurred?
It's a great question. So if you gave the Oppenheimer story to 10 writers, they're going to write 10 completely different stories, right? Not completely different. I mean, they would have to be some way, germane to the events of his life. But the story is not about what happens. It's about the meaning we ascribe to what happens. So I'll give you an example. So let's just put Oppenheimer aside for a second. Somebody asked me years ago, one of my students, they said, "You're always talking about meaning. What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, I'm going to tell you a story right now. I just made something up. And now this is the stupid example I always give. I'm going to make up a story. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, but it will be bereft of meaning." So a woman comes home, says to her husband, "We've been married 20 years. I want a divorce." Husband quits his job, gets on a plane, flies to France, goes out to a carrot farm. The farmer rushes out, hugs the man, and together they open a carrot juice restaurant called Carrot Juice Charlie's. I just told you exactly what happened. Doesn't mean anything. So now here's a story with meaning. Woman comes home, says to her husband, "We've been married 20 years and you're still a stranger to me." The man quits his job and flies to France, which is the last place he saw his father alive when he was 8 years old. He goes out to the carrot farm where his father dropped dead of a heart attack. The farmer, who was the father's best friend, rushes out and hugs the son, still distraught over his inability to save the man, leaving the boy orphaned. Together, they open a carrot juice restaurant in honor of the boy's father, whose name was Charlie, and they begin the process of healing. So it's not what happens, it's the meaning we ascribe to it. I can't tell you how many writers I work with that will say, they'll say, "Well, my character would never do that." And my answer is always, well, if you have an impulse, if an idea comes to you and you dismiss it because you think your idea is your character wouldn't do that, you're actually cutting off the channel. Your job as a storyteller, I believe, is to support what your subconscious gives you. I can't tell you how many times I see second acts start to flatline because we get so attached to our idea of how the story ought to go that we disconnect from the truth of what the story wants to be. I'll give you another example. I don't know why I always bring up It's a Wonderful Life, but I don't know if you remember the midpoint of It's a Wonderful Life, but this is where Mr. Potter offers George Bailey a job. Now imagine for a moment that you're writing this story. That would make no sense logically for the devil, for the primary antagonist to offer the hero a job because they're in direct competition with each other. But here's the thing, as a storyteller, he doesn't offer the George Bailey from Act 1 a job. He offers the George Bailey from the middle of Act 2 a job. This is the midpoint. This is where your protagonist experiences temptation between what they want and what they need. And George Bailey considers taking the job because this is how we experience how desperately he wants to leave Bedford Falls, that he would actually consider working for the devil. So this is why story structure is so important. And this is why an outline, particularly in screenwriting, is essential. Because without an outline, your idea of your story is never going to get you to the end. Because you're going to be so attached to what you think should happen that you're not going to allow yourself to truly be surprised by where the characters want to take you. If you're not allowing yourself to be a little bit embarrassed, a little bit vulnerable, you're going to be protecting yourself in some way. The first exercise I give my writers in the workshops is the fear, I call it the fear exercise. And the exercise is simply, I'm afraid to write this story because. And you write for 5 minutes listing all your fears. And then I ask the writer, I go, why do you think we do this exercise? And they always go, well, it's probably really helpful to become aware of your fears so they don't rule you. And I go, well, that's part of it for sure. But here's the deeper truth, is the fears you have in writing your story are identical in nature to the fears that your protagonist has in the story. And so when you allow yourself to be vulnerable on the page and list your fears in writing the story, you are you're connecting to the truth of your story, and you're discovering how you are uniquely qualified to write this story. Because you're writing from this raw, vulnerable place. I think sometimes we have this idea of what it means to be a good writer. But when I work with writers, I stay out of the result. It's all about process. And I truly believe that the story lives fully and completely within the writer. I fully believe that their subconscious is the seat of their genius. So my job is to facilitate the writer in finding the story that already lives fully and completely within them. So it's if you make the thrill of creation its own reward, you're going to start to get to something that's really exciting. And you've got to, my job is to be curious. It's the Socratic method. It's just asking questions. And I'll say one other thing. It's got to come from love. It's got to come from open-hearted curiosity. It can never be curiosity, because I see creative teachers do this sometimes, of if it's not coming from a spirit of play, like we're just in the sandbox, we don't have to worry about anything, the writer is going to get self-conscious and they're going to protect themselves, which is what you're kind of talking about. And it's so easy for artists. There's something so fragile about this process. It's so easy for artists to get into their ego. I'll tell you a funny story. Louis B. Mayer created the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences in 1929 because he was afraid that the actors were going to unionize. Because he had had the stagehands build his house, And he had discovered they had just unionized. He goes, oh, the actors are next, and they're going to ruin me. Because when they unionize, they're going to want a piece of the action. So the Oscars were created for strictly monetary reasons. It was to save him money. He saved millions of dollars by creating the Academy Awards. The Academy Awards he was appealing to the actors' egos as a way of protecting his business interest. Award shows, when you really think about it, artists don't need awards. Our egos love awards. But when I was a number of years ago, I won something called the Prix Printemps, which is it's in France, it's best foreign novel. And I remember I got flown to Paris, and I was for this thing called Festival America with all these famous authors, and I remember being in my booth, and all these people are around me, and I can feel myself like I was feeling like a big shot, and then I look up, and there's Michael Chabon, who had just won the Pulitzer for Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, and I remember he had his hands in his pockets. And he was kind of looking at me with this half smile like, dude, what are you doing? And he was very sweet. But in that moment, I felt like he saw me. And I was like, oh. I forgot why I was there, which was because I wasn't being celebrated. The channel was being celebrated. Do you understand what I mean? And it's really dangerous for the artist not to differentiate between the channel and the which is all that matters, and then the author, or the ego.
How do you answer the writer who says, "Why do I get stuck?"
I think there's a lot of reasons we get stuck, but I think the big reason is that when we get into the result rather than lose ourselves in the process, we tend to get stuck because we forget that we're the channel, we forget that we're the channel, and that it's not our job to figure out the story. I think that the process of making a story is really about marrying the wildness of your imagination to the rigor of story structure. So you're doing both things simultaneously. If you do one or the other, I think you're going to get stuck. If you just do stream of consciousness writing, you could end up with some brilliant material, but that it won't have any shape to it. Or you can, if you're so focused on story structure that you fail to bring your passion and your curiosity and your everything, your humanity to it, you're going to end up with something that's formulaic. And so I think that's really the key, is to surrender to the process, bring your passion, but also bring your craft, and let go of the result.
So do you see that in your classes or with writing, where you have the perfect student who's making sure that the midpoint is the right spot at the right time, and then you have sort of the, I don't know, for lack of a better term, sort of the Jerry Garcia of writing, and they're just free flowing, and it's amazing and they're brilliant, but you're trying to get them both out of their comfort zone.
I always tell my writers, I say, I know this sounds like a Zen koan, but you've got to be a bad student. I want you to write every day. I don't want you to skip off, but this isn't long division. You're making art. There aren't any rules, but there are principles. And so you've got to, if you try to be a good student, the people that are good students, I can feel them. I'm like, if you ever have to choose between the aliveness of your characters or your idea of your story structure, always choose the aliveness of your characters, because it's going to lead you to the truth of your story structure, not your idea. We've all watched those movies where you can feel that they're hitting the plot points, but you're not being moved. So the number one thing is to let your characters be alive so that you're moved or you're curious. You've got to be willing to surprise yourself. The only way the audience is going to be surprised is if you're allowing yourself to be surprised.
So is that similar to when we go back to my character would never do that, then me as the writer, well, I'm a good student, or me, I'm the one that I'm the contrarian. I sit in the back and I shake my head and I smirk, and we're still in our identity, and that's affecting how we write.
Yeah, I don't think we can really be an artist without our heart being open to some degree, and I think it's one of the reasons I love teaching so much. I find it so satisfying because you teach what you need to learn. And I went to every lecture, every seminar. I read every book on writing, but I was very stubborn for over a decade. And I knew, even though I had a big fancy agent, and I was going out on meetings, and they liked my writing, but my dirty secret was I knew that I had not really had, I hadn't had a third act experience. I hadn't had a true surrender. So I was writing from my ego. And I had been a stand-up comic for years, so I developed a facility with language. I had a strong first-person voice because I was connected to that. But the purpose of story is to reveal a transformation. And I hadn't had a transformation in my own life. And so it wasn't until I called my mentor, and this was like, God, almost 30 years ago now. And I was just hitting bottom. And I said, I'll never forget it. I said, I can't do this alone. And she said, oh my dear, whoever said you had to? And for whatever reason, that was the moment the light bulb went on. And I realized that I was writing my idea of what I thought the market was looking for. And when I let go of that, and I said, I'm going to write something that I'm never going to show to anybody. And it's going to be a story that's so personal and so intimate. And so I wrote this thing very quickly, and that turned out to be the first thing I sold. And that was the thing that sold in a bidding war, became an LA Times bestseller, and won a bunch of awards. And that was the moment I realized, that was the moment I got the lesson. And I think it's the thing that made me really want to pass this thing on to other people, because I'd had such a transformative experience that when I see writers who are trying to figure out how to become successful, it breaks my heart because I had some success and realized that it didn't change anything. The thrill of creation must be its own reward.
Now, is that because we feel shame about writing something that might be salacious, might be interesting, but a nice girl would never write something like that?
I think there's a lot of that. I think that when you look at the stories that really move you, or that you really find compelling, there's often something in there that is scary. I remember the first time I watched Sunset Boulevard. I was like, this is such a weird movie. I can't believe this got made. And Billy Wilder was in his former life before he was a filmmaker, was apparently a gigolo. And that's what the movie's about, essentially. And so he was writing about his personal experience. That's a really brave thing to do. And that movie is weird, but it's also so compelling. It's riveting. You can't I can't believe this is happening. And but you can only write that when you're willing to go to that place. That was the end of my sentence.
Okay. And the thing is, was he judged for that film? Was he judged for putting such smut out there, or he was praised?
Well, you're always going to be judged, and that goes with the territory. So I couldn't tell you, but I have no doubt that some people probably judged it. But I think it also, I don't know if it won the Oscar, but I don't think that probably wasn't his goal. I think the guy was, he was just such a brilliant, artist that his goal was to tell a great story. And when that's your focus, when you're not thinking about the next story, you're not thinking about your career, whatever that means, you're just focused on really telling the truth and exploring your protagonist's dilemma. The results take care of themselves.
How is a story a search for meaning?
When you think of meaning, what we're really talking about is theme. So you can, the plot is really the vehicle that carries the meaning, and the meaning is sort of like the thing that's under the surface, and it's the thing that grows and gets clear. It's almost like the mist is clearing, and by the time you get to the end of the story, I think of every story as moving inexorably towards some kind of difficult choice for the protagonist, and that's when the meaning gets revealed. Oh, this is what it means for Lady Bird to become an artist. You know what I'm saying? So the beginning of the story, she's got this dilemma. She's got a false belief about what it means to be special, and what it means to be special is to it's about outward validation. It's about being perhaps different or weird or having this name that she's created for herself. But by the end of the story, she discovers that what it means to be special is to tap into her ordinariness, because there's nobody else like, I think her name is Christine. There's nobody else like Christine. And so I don't think there's anything braver than writing from your truth, we all have something that we know to be true due to our own, unique set of experiences. And I think that sometimes the most terrifying thing to do is for us to just tell our truth on the page. I think sometimes we think it'll be boring, nobody's going to care. But that's often I think it's always your pot of gold.
Or you could be judged as well. I mean, some people have, day jobs and family responsibilities and neighborhoods, and you get the wrong person, nosing around online, it could cause problems for you. So maybe they don't want to be seen that way, and they don't want to write under a nom de plume. They want to have their name out there, so they don't want to write that story. It's too much.
Yeah, I understand, and that's the deal. You have to
expose it all.
Yeah, I mean,
warts and all.
Yeah, but here's the thing: is that I think of this as a two-tiered process. The first tier is you have to create for yourself. You have to. That's why I teach these 90-day workshops, the 90-day novel and screenplay, and I always tell the writers, you're in the lab, and for the next 90 days, you're going to let go of the result, and you're going to create the story for yourself. And what you're going to discover is that you're going to become transformed by the end of this process, by the end of these 90 days. And that thing that you thought you could never show to anybody else, you're going to have a new relationship to it. And so by the time you get to the end, you're going to discover those things that you could never show anybody suddenly don't hold the same charge.
And the same with 90-day memoir?
Well, the 90-day memoir, right. My 90-day memoir book just came out. And even more so, because with memoir, you can't hide behind your fiction. There's nowhere to hide. So the 90-day memoir is, I think there's something really subversive about writing memoir. I always say that story involves the betrayal of a lie. So you're not betraying, because I think that's what you're getting at is that, oh God, what will they think? I think a lot of times the what will they think has to do with being disloyal. They're going to be mad at me. Will I be? Will I be abandoned? Will I be, ostracized or made a pariah? But the betrayal is the lie you've inherited from your ancestors in one way or another. The lie is always, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, this isn't going to happen for you. It's always some limiting belief we have about ourselves or the world. And so I always say that your story asks everything of you for a reason, because if it didn't, you would never surrender. So your story idea, even if it's memoir, even if your story idea comes to you as an invitation to let go of a limiting belief you have about yourself or the world. And the answer is always love. The answer is always an absence of shame. The answer is always a greater freedom. But you have to walk through the process. You don't get that until the end. So you have to take the risk of walking through that shame. Oh my God, what are they going to think? To discover the wider perspective, the deeper truth, which is that, wait a second, I've been loyal to a false belief that was keeping me, that has kept me in bondage to my past in some way.
Story is not what happens, but the meaning that we ascribe to the event. What does this mean?
Okay, so I'll give you an example. Romeo and Juliet. It's not what happens, it's what it means. So let's say you've got your inciting incident. Romeo sees Juliet. That's the inciting incident, Romeo and Juliet. What does it mean? It could mean anything. Boy sees girl. It doesn't mean anything until you understand what the dramatic question is. Does true love exist? So I'll give you an example. If you're writing a story and you have a sense of your inciting incident, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, how do I reverse engineer this so that I provide with the audience with the necessary information in order to convey meaning when Romeo sees Juliet through the window. That's why Rosalind exists. The story begins with Romeo having his heart broken by Rosalind. He's devastated. This isn't just any boy. This is the world's most romantic boy who's just had his heart broken and doesn't know if he can survive if true love doesn't exist. So the story builds in meaning because, now we know what it means when Romeo sees Juliet. So that's your inciting incident. So what happens next? Every story point is built on the previous story point. If we don't experience his heartbreak over Rosalind, there's no context for seeing Juliet through the window. So now he enters the party, the Montagues and the Capulets. Oh, by the way, we also have to know that there's a feud between the Montagues and the Capulets. So you got to ask yourself, what does my reader need to know in order for the inciting incident to land? Once you got the inciting incident, the next major story point is the opposing argument. I call it the opposing argument. This is where the stakes rise because the problem becomes a dilemma. This is where we understand Romeo's dilemma because of some antagonistic response to the protagonist, which is when Tybalt says, I'm going to kill you. And now we go, oh, wait a second. Romeo has fallen in love with the enemy of his father. His true love could get him killed. That's the dilemma. It's so emotionally elegant. And then that leads to the end of Act 1, where Romeo makes a decision. Am I going to pursue Juliet, or am I going to retreat back to the walls of my own castle? And that's when he makes the decision. He stands under Juliet's balcony. It's not what happens that he proclaims his love to Juliet. It's what it means that he's going to risk his life in order to have his true love. There's always reluctance at the end of the first act. It's so important. There's reluctance. Your protagonist makes a decision that they can't go back on. But if you don't find the reluctance, we lose the connection to the protagonist's dilemma. All right? So he's not reluctant to fall in love with Juliet. He's reluctant to get killed by her father. All right. So the desire never goes away. The desire is always there. The desire for true love from the very beginning. But the dilemma is, am I willing to pay the price for true love?
What fears do you have in real life?
What fears do I have in real life? Ooh, you're giving me you're not lobbing any softballs at me, are you? Why do you ask?
Oh, well, curious. How do you use your fears when writing? So that was the reason. So you don't have to tell us what your fears are, but how do you utilize those fears while you're writing?
That's a great question. I'm working on something right now, and I'm trying to think of the fear is always, is this going to work? Is this going to, is this going to, does this make sense? Am I going to fully, am I going to fully explore this premise? And I think that's why it's important to write the first draft quickly, but not so quickly that you don't really explore it. I think a lot of Stephen King talks about it in his book On Writing. He says he writes his first drafts. He tries to write them in 3 months because it's enough time to get the story down, but it's not so much time that I get into my head and try and because when we get into our heads, we can get stuck. We start to get logical with it. So that's about the best I can answer with the fears.
How does one get in better touch with their fears?
I don't know that we. I don't know that we need to. I think by doing the fear exercise and just simply writing them down, I don't. I think if you make them conscious, I don't know that it's that difficult to get in touch with your fears. I think we all have pretty. I mean, I've been teaching this for decades, and I've never met a writer who has any trouble accessing their fears.
And you've said, I believe, that a writer's fears are sort of a pot of gold.
Well, the writer's fears are the pot of gold because once you connect to them and notice where they live for your protagonist in the story, you're writing from a place of truth. You're writing from a place of vulnerability. And when you're writing from that place, the story has a chance to become universal.
What if a writer says, I don't want to put my fears in the story. My fears are irrelevant. I have this character and they have a greater life than I have.
Well, that's not what I'm talking about. Your fears are universal. So they're human. If I'm not talking about your specific fear. It's not like my fear of spiders. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the nature of your fears. And so if let's say I'm afraid of spiders, and my protagonist is my protagonist, it's the fears that I have in writing this story. It's not my neuroses. It's not my particular phobias that I'm talking about.
Okay, so you're talking about the actual act of writing and the fears that go along with that.
Right.
Okay, not the fact that they don't like heights or...
No, no, it's the nature of my fears. So I'm afraid to write this because people will judge me. People will realize what a weirdo I am. All that stuff. And then when you start to look at your story, you go, oh my God, look at that. My protagonist is actually, if I really start to connect to them, is afraid of what people will think. They're afraid they're a weirdo, therefore nobody will love them, or etc. And so when you connect to that fear, you're really connecting to the truth of your protagonist.
And so to get over that, you've talked about, sort of exposing the story in your 90-day workshops.
Yeah.
But Is it where someone is okay with the fact, well, if they just hate me, I'll just be in a cabin in the woods and no one will, doesn't matter, or they own it and they're okay owning whatever it is they're afraid of in the writing?
Well, yeah, I believe that the desire to write is the desire to evolve or to resolve something we're seeking to understand. So, just going back to what I said earlier, our story comes to us as an invitation to let go of this limiting belief. Oh my God, if people don't like this thing that I wrote, I'll disintegrate, I'll just wither. And then you realize that, no, the truth is that the truth is something entirely other than that. I really believe that every story ultimately is about love. That love is the mystery that's always on the table. And by love, I'm not talking about romantic love or familial love. I mean self-love. And if you look at any story, it's often the journey from some limiting belief they have to an experience of self-love, even if it's a tragedy. The self-love is for the audience. We see the cost of not loving oneself in a tragedy. And self-love manifests itself in an infinite number of ways. So do you understand what I mean? Self-love isn't, I'm not talking about some sort of sentimental notion of, or some sort of new age idea of self-love, but finding one's voice, standing up for the truth, taking the risk of opening one's heart in one way or another. Every story really is about either, is this protagonist in one way or another going to open their heart, or are they going to suffer the consequences of not doing so?
So it could be The Sound of Music or Leaving Las Vegas. It doesn't matter. It's
Right.
the same. It's all about love. It's still at the core.
Yeah. I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because you could say one, their love for themselves was obvious, and for their family, the other, their lack of love for themselves cost them.
Right, and I'm not talking about some egoic love where I'm not talking about the ego. I'm talking about the willingness to be in one's truth, the willingness to set a boundary, the willingness to be humble, the willingness to find compassion. It's one way or another. Story is about the human spirit. It's not intellectual. That's why we're always drawn to story, because it's the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's not math. It transcends logic. It makes no sense when one opens their hearts, and yet to not do so makes life unlivable.
What does it mean for a character to have a primal desire?
The primal desire is the thing that connects your audience or your reader to your protagonist. If there is no primal desire, the story, it can't be universally relatable. So primal desire might be justice or connection or purpose or meaning or belonging or acceptance or ambition. But whatever that primal desire is, that's really ultimately your theme. That's what the thing is about. And the thing that's fascinating about the primal desire is that, and this always surprises writers when I'm working with them, and then I see the lights go on, is that the primal desire is shared by every character in your story. The same, all the characters constellate around this primal desire, around this dilemma. And a dilemma is a powerful desire, primal desire, and a false belief, a misperception of how to obtain this desire. So let's say the desire, let's say you got a story about when I get the promotion, then I'll be validated. So the primal desire is validation, and the false belief is the promotion will provide me with this validation. All right, and so when you start to look at how every character in your story shares this primal desire, you start to notice the story starts to become sort of muscular. All the characters, you start to understand what's actually driving them. I'll give you an example. Let's say you've got a married couple and they both want freedom. And one of them believes that freedom comes from being independently wealthy. Then we'll be financially free. The other partner believes that freedom comes from giving up all worldly possessions. And so it's this uniformity of desire, this primal desire, that creates the conflict in your story. And so the more you connect to the primal desire, the more you start to see, and this surprises writers, but the more you look at your story, you go, oh my God, they want exactly the same thing at nature. The more the story starts to come alive in surprising ways.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be like Succession where everybody's vying for like this power and money, but it could be something as small as, just the love for nature or something. It doesn't have to be like a real, one of the seven deadly sins or something.
Yeah, well, so the desire for nature would be, I'm trying to think of, if I'm desiring nature, I'm trying to think how that would be primal.
Well, to be at one with the world. Sorry to
Okay,
interrupt.
so maybe it's security.
Or to be a child of the universe.
Belonging. Okay, so that's belonging. I want to feel connected. I want to feel a sense of belonging. And so let's say you've got, so if I'm working with a writer, I'll go, what does the protagonist want? Well, they want to go to nature. Why do they want to go to nature? Because they want to have a sense of belonging or being at one with the world. So what happens is your subconscious does this naturally. It creates characters. We dream in archetypes. And so your subconscious creates characters in order to best explore your story. We do this unconsciously. There's nothing. And so you'll notice there will be another character in the story that's going to have an antagonistic response to this character wanting to go off and be in nature. Maybe there's somebody in love with this character. And they're like, well, wait a second. If you go off to, you go off in your solitude, I'm going to lose you. And so now your protagonist has a dilemma. I want connection to nature, but I also want connection to this other person that, doesn't want to leave Manhattan. And now there's the potential for a story.
And when you say archetypes, are we talking about the Jungian archetypes or?
Well, archetypes are primal forces. And so when you think of when you think of a story, when you first start, I'll ask a writer I'll tell me about the character, and they'll sort of look up in the air and then they'll find the character. Do you know what I mean? Like it's in their imagination, but it begins as an experience. It's not like there's this fully formed character in their mind. That's why I'm not a big fan of character sketches, because character sketches can be reductive. Characters don't exist in a vacuum. Human beings exist in relationship to other characters. There's a book called, I think it's Blank by Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks about how we would like to believe that human beings relate characteristically, but we don't. We relate situationally. So sometimes Bill is a liar, and sometimes Bill is honest. Sometimes Ruth is punctual, and sometimes she's late. So I define drama as characters behaving uncharacteristically. So in the story, a nun robs a bank, or a bank robber saves a child. That's why, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, you have to let go of your idea of who who your characters are in order for the truth of the characters to emerge, because they're not sort of a fixed idea. They are, the more you hold your idea of your characters loosely, the more they can become who you need them to be in order to fully exploit your premise.
Can you help us understand how character creates plot?
I think that when we focus on plot, we get stuck. But when you focus on your protagonist's primal desire, the story can move in non-linear ways. And especially when you get into the second act, this is where writers frequently get stuck. Every writer has this experience of getting really excited by a premise, and you jump in and you start writing it, and the first act you're like, oh my God, this is really working. And then at some point it feels like you're sort of moving characters around on a chessboard. You're trying to keep them interesting. Look at When Harry Met Sally. It's so simple. It's so elegant. It's so brilliant. And the dramatic question: can men and women be friends? And so you think about the end of the first act. Harry is the protagonist, and Harry and Sally run into each other again in the bookstore. And he's just gotten a divorce, or he's going through a divorce, and she's just broken up with somebody. And so she says, would you like to go out for dinner? And he says, sure, I've never gone out with somebody that I've never been friends with a woman I've been attracted to. So he's still arrogant and kind of a jerk, and she goes, thanks, Harry. And so notice that even though she invites him, he's the protagonist in the story, and he's the one who makes the decision that he can't go back on. I'm going to go out with Sally as friends. The reluctance is that he's going against his false belief, which is men and women can't be friends. Okay, so that begins the journey of the second act. And now what happens is we have that whole fun and games, as Blake Snyder calls it, and they're getting along great. It's really working as friends. And then that leads to the moment in the diner, that famous diner scene where she has she fakes the orgasm, which is so brilliant because this is where your protagonist has this sort of false hope. It's going to work. We can be friends. And in some way, they're still acting out this sort of sexual relationship without having a sexual relationship. But then it's New Year's Eve. We get to the midpoint. And this is where your protagonist experiences temptation between what they want and what they need. Ding, ding, it's 12 o'clock, everybody's kissing, and they suddenly realize, my God, we're falling in love, but we have to be friends. Brilliant. So the story moves in a new direction. And then now they're suffering. They can't maintain this sexual tension anymore. So what do? They set each other up with their best friends. The story moves in a new direction, and the best friends end up falling in love with each other. And now we're witness to true love, and now it's excruciating because you're always the last person to know. They're in love with each other, but they're so committed to this idea of friendship that they're not willing to betray that idea. And that leads to the end of the second act, where she's heartbroken because her former boyfriend is getting married, and Harry comes over to comfort her, and they sleep together. And so the question, can men and women be friends, is the answer is no, they can't. But what you can do is in the Act 3, you can integrate the two. So we can be friends, but we also need to find a way to be lovers and still be companions. And that moves you into the third act. So what you'll notice with Harry is that the desire never changes. His relationship to his desire is constantly changing. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Let's say you've got Bill, who asks Sally out on a date because he wants connection. That's the primal desire. I want connection. He asks Sally out on a date. Then he asks Sally to marry him because he wants connection. And so he gets married. And then he has an affair because he wants connection. And then he gets a divorce because he wants a connection. And then he goes back to Sally and says, I made a terrible mistake, because he wants connection. In other words, story isn't about will Bill find connection. Story is about will Bill reframe his relationship to what true connection means, which is until I'm connected to myself, it's not possible to have connection with others. It's the same thing with Harry. Harry believes that men and women can't be friends, and he's correct. But what he doesn't realize is that when he falls in love, what he can have is he can have a lover that is also his best friend. So he thinks you can only have one or the other, but until he's able to surrender this sort of false belief, he's not able to integrate the two. And that's when he realizes at the end of the story, I don't want to be away from my best friend for one more minute.
So going back to what we talked about in the beginning of the interview, which was finding truth, what is the truth for Harry and what is the truth for Sally?
So the truth, that's a good question. How do I answer this? The truth is, in any well-told story, both characters are right. Okay, and this is the challenge in telling a story, is that story is an argument. I know it sounds dry, but story is really an argument. Can men and women just be friends? That's the argument. And the storyteller's job is to play both sides with equal integrity. All right? And so the truth is about taking the argument and exploring the opposing argument. That's what the whole movie is about, is exploring the opposing argument of we can be friends, but what's going to happen is that we are going to become increasingly attracted to each other, reaching this sort of supersaturation point where they have fallen in love but haven't yet consummated it. And so until they let go of this idea, which is really just it's really just a sort of something they're doing to protect themselves from opening their heart. Remember, because every story ultimately is about self-love, which is allowing myself. One act of self-love is to allow myself to be loved, and so that's what happens in the third act. The third act is about synthesis or integration, where Harry realizes that the only way that I can have my friend, well, not the only way I can have my friend, but I'm no longer willing to just be friends. I actually have fallen in love with this person, and now I need to take the difficult choice to let go of my limiting belief, which is that men and women can't be friends, and he's able to fall in love.
And so not just finding love in a relationship, but that each one, Harry and Sally, need to learn how to love themselves?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Otherwise, so both characters are transformed at the end. The protagonist is typically the character that has the largest change, which is Harry. So when he surrenders his false belief that men and women can't be friends, he's able to integrate the two ideas that we can be friends. We must be friends in order to be lovers.
And how does Sally's need to love herself manifest?
Well, she's not the protagonist. I don't know that Sally changes as much as Harry. I think that she realizes that she's in love with Harry at the end of the second act. She's got that, they've made love, she's got that big smile on her face, and he bolts. And so the act three, the big change is for Harry to come around and let go of his fear of commitment in order for them to be united.
Why do you say that story structure is not a conceptual model?
Well, I think that story structure is frequently taught by story analysts, and conceptual means intellectual. It's a conceptual model, as opposed to how I see story structure as an experiential model. And if you've ever read that book, I think it's called On Death and Dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she identifies the 5 stages of grief. I think they're denial, depression, anger, denial, acceptance, and bargaining in no particular order. In the same way, there's 5 stages of grief. There seems to be a series of stages that the human animal always goes through in their journey toward transformation. And so when I'm working with writers, I think that this is a really organic way to explore story structure. So if you look at the protagonist's journey, I think of it as there's 13 sort of stages or story points. There's the in Act One. There's the establishing the world. There's setting up the world, and very early on there's the protagonist's dilemma. And we understand the dilemma. It's personal to the protagonist, but it's universal to the reader. So, like in Romeo and Juliet, does true love exist? And I don't want to live if true love doesn't exist. That's the dilemma. And then there's the inciting incident. Something happens that sets the story in motion, and that leads to the opposing argument where the dilemma becomes apparent, and that leads to a decision. So notice these are experiences. Decision is an experience. Temptation is an experience. Suffering, surrender, these are all experiences. They're not feelings. So sometimes writers will confuse experience with feeling. We're not interested in characters' feelings particularly. It's actually kind of meaningless. But what we are interested in is the experience they're going to, which can contain a whole host of feelings. So that's what I mean by.
What is the wildness of our imagination? And didn't you say earlier that sometimes it needs to be reined in?
No, I don't think I ever said that. I don't think the wildness of your imagination needs to be reined in, but I think what you're talking about is that it needs to be, I think the process of building a story is you always have to bring your passion and your wild mind to it. But when you're saying reined in, I'm talking about marrying it to the rigor of story structure. Okay, so our job is to distill our ideas to their nature. Everything you imagine belongs in your story when you distill it to its nature. So I'll give you an example. Let's say Sally lives with her parents, and she lives in the garage above their. She lives above the garage, and then she takes and you're writing the story and you go, oh, she's going to take a job in Ohio. She's going to take this job offer and she's going to move from Los Angeles to Ohio. Well, I'll ask the writer, why do you make the choice that she moved to Ohio? And they'll go, well, because I grew up in Ohio. I go, okay, so now you've got a story where you're exploring a mother-daughter relationship. And the mother's in Los Angeles and the daughter's in Ohio. So is this a movie where they just constantly have phone calls? And they go, oh. And so what's the story really about? Well, the story really is about the daughter's individuation from her mother. So she could move next door, she could move across town, the story really is about the daughter leaving the nest and what happens to this relationship as a result. That's what I mean by you want to distill your ideas to their nature. Not about Ohio, it's about leaving the nest.
Does it matter, let's say in this situation, if Sally's 21 or if she's 41?
Of course, everything matters. Everything, I think this whole process is about making choices and holding them loosely. All right, so let's say you go, so you have to make a choice. You have to go, all right, Sally's 21. And then as you continue to investigate the story, you go, wait a second. I think that she has been living with her parents for far too long. And now she desperately wants to get married and start a family before it's too late. Well, 21, I don't know. I think she needs to be 41 to fully exploit this premise. So the more you stay connected to what you want to express, the more creating a story becomes a dialogue. Really think about creating a story as your ideal reader is sitting in the corner asking you questions. Why is she 21? Is that the best choice? That's why I say your characters, they're not real people. They're functions of your dramatic question. And so the more you inquire into the world of your story, the more the characters become who you need them to be in order to fully exploit your premise.
How do we marry the wildness of our imagination with story structure?
I think the process of building a story is about going from the general to the specific. So I think story always begins with the wildness of your imagination. You don't begin, it always begins with an image, image of the character or some kind of, I don't even think we think about it consciously, but there's some kind of tension. There's always something that's seeking resolution. And that's when the story idea comes to you. And the moment the story idea comes to you, whether you're conscious of it or not, or conscious of it or not, your first question is often, gee, I wonder what might happen next. And now whether you're aware of it or not, you're in story structure. You're thinking like a storyteller. But if you don't apply structure to it, your story is going to start to flatline. You're going to start to try and manufacture interesting scenarios, but the story's not going to build in meaning. And so the only way to really come up with a fully realized story is to apply the rigor of story structure to these characters in order to discover how to realize the fullest arc for the protagonist.
You teach story structure in 3 words?
Well, yeah, I think that story structure can be distilled to desire, surrender, transformation. So desire, your protagonist has to want something. The stakes have to be life and death. And that's going to be the engine that's driving your story, is will this protagonist get what they want? Will they fulfill this primal desire? Now here's the thing, at some point they're going to experience a dark night of the soul where they must surrender the meaning they made out of this primal desire. So otherwise there can't be a transformation, which is the 3rd word, desire, surrender, transformation. If you don't have those 3 elements, you don't really have a story. It's impossible to have a satisfying story. And I think that the surrender is the linchpin. I think that this is where all the magic happens in story, is the protagonist's surrender, their dark night of the soul. Because this is where, you think of it as the dark night of the soul as a coin with 2 sides. On one side is despair, and then on the other side is this wider perspective. Often a gift appears. It's where your protagonist lets go of the appearance of their situation for the reality of their situation. For example, let's say the appearance of my situation is all is lost, or I'm all alone. There's this cry into the void for your protagonist. That's the dark night of the soul. And then the other side is where they accept the reality of the situation. That's where they reframe their relationship to their experience. So this is where I'll act it out for my students. I'll go, okay, what's the cry into the void? And I'll go, well, all is lost. I'll go, okay, all is lost becomes, oh, now that I've lost everything that was not really working, I can begin anew. So the beginning of Act 3, when your protagonist accepts the reality of their situation, they step into their true power. That makes sense? They step into their true power. It's like that line in American Beauty where Lester Burnham blackmails his boss. And the boss says, you're insane. And Burnham says, no, I'm just a guy with nothing to lose. That's the protagonist at the beginning of Act 3. And the irony is that we step into our true power as a result of having nothing to lose. We let go of everything that wasn't working. And that's why I say story involves the betrayal of a lie. Betrayal is a violent word. Nobody gives us permission to betray. But what we're betraying is this false belief that we've had about ourselves or the world. And when you are willing to betray that lie, you're able in Act 3 to take action, or your protagonist is able to take action toward giving themselves what they need as opposed to what they want.
Sorry.
They're totally distracted right now. But I'm on a roll.
No, you're doing excellent.
So
Not just great, excellent.
Okay. Your protagonist is able to take action toward giving themselves what they need as opposed to what they want. Do you follow, or are you completely distracted right now?
I am a little distracted, but when you said surrender, are we surrendering to an individual? We're surrendering to an idea?
Yes, an
all
idea.
All the above.
Well, you're surrendering to a false belief that you have about yourself or the world. You're surrendering to your theme. So let's say, for example, the theme is belonging. All right. So I make meaning out of belonging. My powerful desire. Remember, there's a dilemma at the heart of every story. Your protagonist is struggling with a dilemma. A dilemma is a problem that can't be solved without creating a new problem. There's two ingredients to a dilemma: powerful desire, I want to belong, and the false belief, I will belong when someone out there accepts me. That's the false belief. Because we all know true belonging only comes from within. When I belong, when I'm able to accept myself, then I'm able to find the place where I actually belong. So the dark night of the soul, the cry into the void might be, I don't belong anywhere. That's the appearance of the situation. The reality of the situation is, now that I recognize that all my attempts to belong have led me to this place of isolation, what I need to do is surrender the meaning I made out of belonging, and so I can accept the truth, which is that what I must do is I must find a way to belong to myself. I must be true to myself. And that's the journey of Act 3. The journey of Act 3 is in surrendering, I begin to pursue what I need as opposed to what I want. What I need is to belong to myself. So now I take action toward belonging to myself, and lo and behold, this leads to that climactic moment of the third act where your protagonist makes a difficult choice between what they want and what they need. What I want is to belong. What I need is to be true to myself. And so if you can find some way to dramatize, remember I always say character suggests plot. If you can find a way to dramatize this, I need to belong, I need to be true to myself, you'll find that there's a difficult choice involved. So like, for example, it's like the Hallmark card where they say, if you love something, let it go. If it comes back, it's yours. If it doesn't, it never was. So let's say I want to belong to something outside of myself. It's only in letting it go that I can actually have it. Because if all that happens in the story is I find belonging to some external person or thing, I will forever be in bondage to that thing until I recognize that I don't require that thing in order to be free.
The person having the dark night of the soul, if they've been rejected by the love or the group or whatever, then they go, okay, well, I have nothing less to lose.
No, absolutely not, because the desire to belong never goes away. The desire to belong is alive from the very beginning to the very end. The desire to belong doesn't go away because has that ever gone away from anybody? No, but what happens is it gets reframed. So transformation doesn't mean that I'm forever without doubt and confusion. It doesn't mean that I've suddenly freed myself from the desire to belong. But what it does do is it reframes my relationship to belonging, and I recognize that when I put my want before my need, it leads to pain. So in spite of the fact that I still want to belong, that's why I say it's a difficult choice. If it was an easy choice, the protagonist would have made it in Act 1. It's a difficult choice, but I now recognize that my desire for belonging cannot trump my need to be true to myself. So if you really explore the protagonist's journey in Act 1 and Act 2, you'll probably notice that the desire to belong leads me to betray myself in some way. I will do anything about, like, I don't know, I think Mean Girls, or where I will do anything to belong to this group. And or Lady Bird, she ends up betraying her best friend. She ends up allowing herself to be used by the cool boy. And she reaches this dark night of the soul where she realizes that all my attempts to belong, to be special, have led me to this place of despair. Now what I must do is give myself what I need. It doesn't mean I have any idea. I don't know if I'll ever get what I want, but I do know that I can no longer continue doing that, whatever that is. I always say that your protagonist in Act 1 and Act 2 are running toward their goal only to run into a brick wall at the end of the second act. At the end of the second act, they run into the brick wall and they turn around and they realize that in running toward what they thought they wanted, they've actually run away from their true self. And so Act 3 is about giving myself what I need with, the stakes have to rise exponentially in Act 3. They don't, because we don't know if the protagonist is going to succeed in getting what they want, but we do know that if they don't give themselves what they need, they will forever be in bondage to this idea of what they wanted.
Just to add to the ladybird part, and I don't remember at what point in the story it was, but where Laurie Metcalf, the mom, confronts the daughter and says, like, you know, you thought we were going to live in this house for, you know, this was our starter house and we ended up living here forever, and your dad, and, you know, all that kind of confronts the fact that they were sort of lower middle class and that they were, you know, but she did it all to try to hold it together.
The mother did it.
Right. And sort of like shows that she did try to do these things for the daughter, and the daughter wanted what was across the tracks, which was kind of fake and kind of, but she wanted that, and that was a golden moment when, that was another sort of turning point.
Well, first of all, how amazing is Laurie Metcalf?
She's amazing.
Oh my God, I love her. Yeah. So, what was the question?
There wasn't. It was just an additive.
Got it. Yeah. Absolutely. Well,
chiming in.
That moment is another. So this is what's great about storytelling is that both characters are right. Laurie Metcalf is right, and so is Saoirse Ronan. Both characters are what they're both trying to do is connect, and they're both trying to get what they want, and what they want is identical in nature, which is, and this is, a lot of stories are about the desire to be seen. And so I always say that what separates, or the only thing that separates your protagonist from an antagonist, is that your protagonist is willing to surrender. That's why there's that amazing moment in Lady Bird when mom doesn't get out of the car and say goodbye at the airport, and it's devastating. And what makes Lady Bird heroic is that she's able to call her mom at the end and say thank you and I love you. It's so moving and it's so simple. It's such a simple scene. She wakes up in the hospital and she's I think she's got a black eye or something like that, and she walks into a church, which, this is a story about somebody who wants to be sort of eccentric and different, and she walks into the most traditional institution on earth and listens to a choir singing, and it's this transcendent moment. There's no speaking, and then she calls her mom, and I don't know why I'm moved thinking about this scene, but she says, "Do you remember what it was like the first time you drove in Sacramento?" And it's the simplest scene. And, you know, you think about Greta Gerwig, she was writing from a place of something so personal in her. And the scene's power doesn't come from the scene itself. It's cumulative. It's everything the protagonist has experienced prior to that. And that's what I'm talking about. The story builds in meaning as it progresses. If we saw that scene as a standalone scene, it would be meaningless. But because of everything we've experienced, because of the journey we've been taken on, it's profoundly moving.
Al, you brought up something very interesting about deserving and feeling like it's our place within writing.
We were talking about a book when I got invited to teach at Penn Center USA about, I don't know, 12 or 15 years ago, and it was to bring 3 writers to publication, which is a really bizarre notion, especially if I'm all about process, and the idea was, result. It ended up working for, at least for one of the writers. They got a publishing contract. But I realized that craft, it wasn't just about craft. It was about these writers realizing that there's this invisible barrier between being unpublished and published, where you realize that your simple truth is enough, and that what you have to express deserves to be heard. And so I created this. I went to 25 published authors, and I said, "Would you write an essay about your experience?" The book is called My First Novel, and I had them write their experience that led to the publication of their first book, so that people could kind of walk through the journey and realize they're not alone. That every published author at one point was unpublished, and what they had to walk through was the willingness to sort of tell their truth on the page, in spite of the fact that they have no idea what the result will be.
Now, I know you teach memoir writing as well, I believe. Do you find sometimes, though, that there's an opposite of someone that maybe they think their story is so amazing, and, my family came over on the Mayflower and I'm amazing, and I need to tell my story, and it's not really that interesting? So
no, the stories are always interesting.
They're always interesting.
Again,
okay.
It's not what happens, it's the meaning we ascribe to it. So everybody has a story to tell, and everybody's story is valid. And my job is to facilitate writers in finding the story that lives fully and completely within them. The story isn't the facts. It's not the events of their life, but it's the meaning they ascribe to these events. It could be anything. It could be about your relationship with your cat. That can be absolutely fascinating if you're true to your point of view. Because everybody has a unique point of view. But what we have to do is we have to overcome that sort of self-consciousness that, oh, gee, what are other people going to think? When you allow yourself to let go of the result and put yourself in the process, that's when, I can't tell you how many times in the workshops, we do a lot of stream of consciousness writing exercises. So a writer will write, they'll write for 5 minutes, stream of consciousness, and then they'll read it in the class. And they'll think it's a toss-up. Oh, I don't know. And the rest of the class they'll be crying, they'll be moved by this thing that the writer. So it's great. A workshop is valuable because it can reflect back to you what you didn't realize was inside of you.
I think you've said about comedy, because you made your living as a stand-up comic from a very young age.
I did.
That just because you get a laugh doesn't mean you're funny.
Right.
Okay, sorry. And so to follow up...
I think there's a lot of...
That's not flying to me right now. Okay. But go ahead.
I mean, just because I think there were there's a lot of tricks that stand-up comics would employ, to get a laugh, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're original.
Okay, and so could the same be applied to writing in any form? Just because you're read doesn't mean you're an actual writer or that you're a good writer.
Well, I think that's subjective. I think I don't really have any interest in judging whether or not, I wouldn't even, judging whether or not a writer is a good writer. I know that when I read, there's things that I'm attracted to or drawn to, and there's things that just don't particularly interest me. But, I mean, I don't know how you can judge an artist. Is Taylor Swift better than Fiona Apple? I mean, just because Taylor Swift is the biggest thing in the world right now, I think she's terrific. I listen, we're driving around and I listen to her on the radio. But I don't think that one's value or I don't think we can judge the quality of one's work based on their the size of their audience. I was shocked. The Golden Globes have a new they've got a new what do you call it, category that's box office gross. It's just this is such a North American idea that in Europe, they love artists. They revere artists. In North America, they love rich artists. It's strange, and it's almost like they've now confused quality with box office, which is, we all know is ridiculous, but I think artists have to be really careful, because if when our desire is to our desire is to sell something, the channel starts to close, and we're not really connected. We're not making art anymore. Where it doesn't even mean you won't be successful. It just means it's I don't know that it's really art anymore.
Well, and that's the beauty maybe of something like Lady Bird, is that it seems more like it wouldn't appeal to the mainstream, but it obviously did.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of people who are artists or creative or weird, and I'm pointing at myself here, we're not necessarily meant for the mainstream. But if you can cross over and they can sort of find value in what you do, that's great. Right. But that's rare.
And I think that's life. Is that you have your voice, and you have to trust it, and if you really trust it, you'll find your audience. And does it? I had a writer call me up once, and he said, I want to write a novel. And if the novel is not a bestseller, I will consider myself a failure. And I said, I can't help you. Go to UCLA Extension. And 3 years later, I'm teaching my workshop, and this guy walks in, and he had an unusual name. And so when I asked his name, I was like, that voice sounds really familiar. And it was this guy. And he had sort of hit his bottom. He'd been humbled. And he did really good work. And I think sometimes, whatever it takes, the universe is gonna bring us to our knees, hopefully, so that we're willing to be a channel for the story that wants to come through us. We have to let go of the result, or you're never gonna make art.
How does our subconscious factor into writing?
Well, I really believe that our subconscious is the seat of our genius. And I think, as I said earlier, genius is not a noun, it's a verb. It's something we all have access to. So the story really comes from your subconscious. It's sort of like there's stories in the atmosphere, in the zeitgeist. And if you don't grab that story that comes to you, how often do writers go, oh God, I had that idea. I should have written that. That was really good. That was a good idea. So they're all floating around up there in the ether, and when it comes to you, you're either going to write it, or somebody else is going to find their way to write it.
How does a writer tap into their own subconscious?
I think what I'm really teaching, I'm teaching a process of connecting your wild imagination to story structure. But what I'm really teaching is self-trust, trusting yourself at the deepest level as an artist, trusting that you're not the author, you're the channel. So I think because I had sort of a life-changing experience where I realized that that the story wasn't coming from my conscious mind, that I couldn't manufacture a story, and that whenever I tried, the writing was always mediocre. But that when you trust your subconscious and you tap into that place that's beyond your sort of logical centers, the story comes alive in a way that is so surprising, and that our job is to stay out of this magical alchemical process that's happening. Just stay out of it. It's almost like our job as artists is really to protect the channel, so that the story can come through you. And And when you do that, what happens sometimes is the story that starts to come through you can be, it can scare you sometimes. It can be shocking. It can be embarrassing. It can be, and our job is to hold a space for that. One thing I always tell my writers, and they often don't listen, is don't talk about your work while you're in the middle of your work, especially in your first draft. Because our spirit, all it really wants to do, our subconscious, all it really wants to do is express. And when you tell your story to somebody else, your subconscious has experienced it being told. And it's sort of like it takes the air out of the balloon. Because all it really wants to do is tell the story. And now I've told you the story. Sometimes that can feel satisfying. You don't want it to feel satisfying. You want to contain that sort of tension or contain that energy so that you're really connected to this story as it's passing through you.
Why do you think we have an urge to tell others, but we're excited, we want feedback, we're bragging?
Well, I wouldn't think of it as bragging, but I would think of it as oftentimes validation. Hey, what do you think of my story? And the other problem with that is that even the best intentions, first of all, there's a lot of people that don't understand artists and aren't supportive, and they can sabotage you. But the other thing is that there are a lot of friends that are with best intentions go, I don't understand that. That's weird. It's why a woman doesn't talk about her pregnancy in the first 3 months, because it's too early. It's too nascent. That's the 90-day novel, the 90-day workshops, they're 3-month workshops. I tell my writers, don't talk about it for the first 3 months. Get the first draft down. Wouldn't you rather tell your friends, I just wrote a novel, than I'm working on one?
Yeah, I'm always a proponent of once something's completed, not, hey, big news coming, because I think it takes the air out of it, and also it takes the air out of it for you.
And if you're saying to your friends, I'm working on something, what they do with the best of intentions is say, how's it going? And you know what? There's a roller coaster that we ride as we're creating something. There's days where we are really excited and inspired, and there's days where we are despondent. And the last thing I want is to be reporting to somebody else about this very sort of sacred experience while I'm in the middle of it.
Are we keeping secrets?
Are we keeping secrets? Yeah, I guess so. But these are, I always say this is the one area where I'll say to a writer, you've told everybody, haven't you? And they'll go, yeah, I did. Okay, this is the one time you can lie to everybody. How's your writing going? I'm not working on it right now. Stop talking about it. I feel very protective of writers in their process. Don't talk about it. I don't think a lot of good can come of it. Somebody will say, well, my spouse really is really supportive. That's great, but on some level, I think we're often just asking for validation. What I'd rather you ask yourself is, where does this experience live for my protagonist in the story? This desire for validation. What's going on for me right now, and where does this live in the story? Because when you start writing a story, you have radar, and your radar is picking up everything. You hear a voice in the supermarket, or you notice the quality of the light at sunset. And you go, oh, I can use that. Oh, I see. When the moment our subconscious, the moment we decide to write a story, our subconscious makes an agreement with the universe to fulfill this. And it might sound sort of a little supernatural, but I really believe that the universe wants us to create, because I really believe the desire to write is the desire to evolve, to resolve something we're seeking to understand. And so when we tune into that place, we got to stay in that channel as much as we can. Stop talking about it. All you're doing is you're sort of disturbing the reception.
So stories find us?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I couldn't tell you where any story idea has come from. It's just, yeah, I think our stories find us. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? How these story ideas, it's almost like they are, they're looking for a vessel through which to, be realized, so they can, advance humanity one step closer toward, some kind of understanding of ourselves.
I'm wondering how this quote relates to the protagonist's dilemma. It's from George Bernard Shaw. The moment we want to believe something, we suddenly see all arguments for it and we become blind to the arguments against it.
Can you read it again?
Sure. George Bernard Shaw, the moment we want to believe something, we suddenly see all arguments for it and become blind to all arguments against it.
Such a great quote, and I think that speaks in some part to why writers write, because our job is to play both sides of the argument with equal integrity. So in spite of the fact that I don't believe this thing, story isn't about, it's not binary. It's not do I believe it or do I not believe it. Story is about taking, Einstein says genius is the ability to hold two opposing thoughts simultaneously. And so that's really what a storyteller is doing, is taking these two seemingly disparate ideas and watching them collide in order to arrive at a deeper truth. And so, there's an exercise I do with my writers. I call it the credo exercise. And the exercise is this. One thing I feel strongly about is, and it's not from the point of view of your protagonist, it's from the point of view of the author. And so I have them write for 5 minutes. One thing I feel strongly about is, and then what I have them do is I take what you just wrote and frame it as one single arguable statement. For example, I feel strongly that everyone should be treated equally. All right? So then you take that statement, and now I want you to find an opposing argument to that statement. Okay? And so, well, I think everyone should be treated equally, except what about terrible criminals, for example? What about people who have done terrible crime? Should they be treated equally? And so now you've got the beginning of an interesting story. In other words, the credo exercise helps you connect to the antagonistic forces in your story. Not your antagonists, not your characters, but you start to see how the more you start to explore these antagonistic forces, the more you begin to recognize that your job as a storyteller is exploring that Shaw quote that you just read, which is, the job of the storyteller is to play both sides with equal integrity. So in spite of the fact that I believe that everyone should be treated equally, let me explore that question through an antagonistic force, or through a character who should not be treated equally. So like, you think about that, I don't know why it jumped in my head, but that movie with Sean Penn and Susan Sarandon, Dead Man Walking. So this is about a man who's on death row for committing a terrible crime, and Susan Sarandon. And so you can see that question: should this character be treated equally? And Susan Sarandon, this is a true story, and she played the nun. I can't remember the nun's name, but she comes in with compassion and humanity, and he is so sort of entrenched. He's so sort of he's got so much sort of emotional scar tissue that he's not willing to really confess to his crime. And the whole journey, the whole story is about these two human beings coming together in order to arrive at a deeper truth, which is that perhaps the only way he will be able to die a free man, because he's on death row, is by taking responsibility for his crime.
I've been watching the movie The Help, and then started reading or listening to the audiobook, which is much more detailed. And in that sense, it's a different look at, the antagonist, which is a whole town and a whole society that thought there should be separate bathrooms, and that trying to, under the guise of doing the right thing, we're gonna get this initiative so that we can have these special bathrooms for all the help. And not really sure where I'm going with it, but it's I know you're probably asking me that.
I'm enjoying this.
But it's so fascinating to hear the voices of these characters, because I'm listening to the audio book. So each one, it's played by, I think, a different actress each time reading it, the part, and then the one woman who sort of crosses the boundary lines, which, again, I know there were some pushback against the story because they felt it was trivialized. That's its own separate issue, and maybe in some parts it definitely is. But that the one person who sort of crosses these lines is the journalist who wants to write about these women and sort of share this story.
The one thing I think that is so instructive about that is that is the author's name Catherine Stockett?
Yes, it is.
And this might be apocryphal, but I heard she sent that book out to like over 100 agents or publishers before or maybe she had an agent, but it went out to everybody passed on it. And I think it's a real lesson in perseverance that sometimes the universe tests us, and that we have to believe in the thing that we've created in order for it to find its home. And I was really fascinated by that story, how she stayed with it.
Why is it so important for a writer to understand dilemma?
The dilemma is the source of your story. Dilemma is how your theme gets dramatized. And every writing book I ever read talked about the dramatic question. And I always got stuck when I thought in terms of, or the dramatic problem. Because when you think in terms of problem, you think in terms of solving the problem. We solve intellectually. And as I said, Einstein says you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. So we get stuck. But when you start to recognize that your protagonist doesn't have a problem, but they have a dilemma, which is a problem that can't be solved without creating another problem, the story starts to open up in a way that you might not have previously imagined. Because a dilemma is an experience. A problem is intellectual, but a dilemma is an experience. And when you think in terms of dilemma, you let go of the idea that there's any way to solve this. You can't solve a problem. You can't solve a dilemma. You can only resolve it through a shift in perception. And so a dilemma, when a protagonist is struggling with a dilemma, they are going to be forced to let go of the meaning they made out of their goal in order to begin to pursue what they need as opposed to what they want. Because I can never solve this dilemma based on my, as Einstein says, based on my current approach. So dilemma is the source of your story.
And is that where the dark night of the soul comes in?
Yeah, the dark night of the soul is where the dilemma becomes apparent to your protagonist. I don't necessarily mean that the protagonist goes, I'm struggling with a dilemma right now. But the dark night of the soul is where your protagonist experiences some kind of cry into the void, where they go, I'm all alone, or I have failed. It's where your protagonist recognizes the impossibility of getting what they want, as opposed to the difficulty. It's not difficult, it's literally impossible based on my current approach, causing me, because the only way the phoenix can rise from the ashes is after it's died. Okay, so story isn't about will your protagonist get what they want. Story is about will your protagonist die to their old identity or their old idea of the meaning they made out of their goal, so they can begin to pursue what they need. And in pursuing what they need, then it becomes possible to get what they want if what they want belongs in their life. Because sometimes what we want doesn't belong in our life. And when we finally let it go, we're able to have something that does belong in our life, something that's actually going to be satisfying.
Why do you say that theme is misunderstood?
Well, I hear writers talk about theme all the time, or they're talking about themes, all the themes in my work. I think what they're often talking about are issues. There's a difference between issue and theme, and I think it's important to understand the distinction, because homelessness is an issue. It's not a theme. Or, you know, the economy is an issue. It's not a theme. Themes are primal. They're primal desires, like connection, meaning, purpose, success, justice, survival, and themes are how the protagonist's dilemma gets explored or gets dramatized. All right, and so when you think in terms of theme, you're thinking in terms of some kind of powerful desire and false belief. So an issue is not a theme.
But within those issues, though, there could be a theme.
Absolutely.
So if someone, like, let's take the movie Into the Wild, or the book by
Love
John
that
Krakauer.
movie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Excellent film. Haven't read the book, but so that was about belonging. And so he goes into the wild and lives in this school bus. So you could say he's homeless by choice there. And it was because he felt he didn't belong. And he only felt he belonged within sort of the world of nature, you know, up in Alaska.
Yeah, right.
So
Belonging or acceptance,
Sure.
which are sort of in the same ballpark. But yeah, absolutely. And the dilemma, it's just so elegantly rendered. The dilemma is that in order to belong, it could cost me my life, which it does.
right.
And so he finally he's being true to himself. He's following his inner desire. So is that movie a tragedy?
I mean, personally, I feel it is. I know a lot of people have wanted to retrace his steps, Christopher McCandless.
Really?
Yeah, there's all these YouTube videos. In fact, I think they had to remove the school bus because so many people were trying to go out there to either pay homage to him or experience what maybe he experienced in his last days. I don't know.
Well, that's interesting because you know, when you think of tragedy, you think of the protagonist not getting the lesson, or getting it too late. That's an interesting movie because I never really thought about that, but I'm not sure that is a tragedy. At least the way we experience it is that he was true to himself, and while it cost him his life, there's something he draws on the board at the end. I can't remember. He writes something. I can't remember what that is.
Right. I mean, I know he felt a lot of pressure, at least in the film. Again, I haven't read the book, but that he felt this pressure and he kind of renounced anything materialistic.
Oh, that's right.
And went on the road. And he met these different people. I know there was a great, Catherine Keener character.
Vince Vaughn.
Right. And so he kind of met these different fringe people.
Yeah.
And there's this one scene where he's maybe in LA and he's kind of dirty and scruffy and he's like staring at a bar and he sees people his age and there's just this look on his face. It's part anger, it's part disgust, but it's also part feeling almost as if he had been left out and he'd been sort of wronged.
You know, this is where I think the process of making a story is going from the general to the specific, and I would have to watch the movie again, but I want to talk about something. Is it about belonging or is it about connection? You know, and this is where this is why I always say it's the process of building a story is about going from the general to the specific, because at the beginning you might go, I think the story is about belonging. And this is why we want to gently always be asking ourselves, what's this thing about? What's this thing about? Because as storytellers, I feel like we're trading in metaphor. We're always looking for the thing that tells us what this thing is about. We're all, and we do it unconsciously. But I think I think our job is to become conscious of the things that we're unconscious of. I think that might have been a segue. But what I was going to say was, when you work with story structure, the primal desire, which it might be connection, informs the structure questions. I work with, I have these structure questions that I give my students that are experiential questions. And the questions, or the questions, the structure questions inform the primal desire. And what I mean by that is you might think it's about belonging, but the more you start to inquire into these structure questions, you go, wait a second, it actually starts to feel like it's about the desire for connection. Like when you just described him looking into the window, the bar, I'm hearing he's searching for a connection, and he finds the connection with nature. And so this is why creating a story is about going from the general to the specific, because you're marrying the wildness of your imagination, which is connecting to that primal desire. Is it connection? Is it belonging? Is it the truth? With the rigor of story structure, which is these structure questions. And the more you work with both of them simultaneously, I think I'm answering a previous question now, the more the story starts to cohere, but in a non-linear way. You know, because the structure questions are experiential questions. And so character suggests plot. When you start to connect to your characters, you know, like for example, let's say you go, well, in the midpoint, what's his name?
Christopher McCandless.
Christopher McCandless. Mm-hmm. Let's say the midpoint is where your protagonist experiences temptation between what they want and what they need. And something happens, an event happens, your protagonist responds by committing fully to their goal. And so you think to yourself, what is this temptation with regards to connection? This temptation with regard, it's coming back to me. I think there's a scene where he's returned to his family in some way. And I have a feeling, I could be wrong about this, it's been a long time, but that I could go back to the familiar, or I could go forward into the unknown. I'm pretty sure there's a scene where he's with his family and then he says, no, I can't do it. And that's the temptation. And that's a critical moment. This is the difference between a lot of the writing books. They talk about the midpoint is where there's a what's the term? There's a reversal. I have no idea how to write a reversal. It's a head word. Do you follow? And so if I'm required to write or manufacture a reversal, I'm going to get stuck. But if I think in terms of temptation, if I think in terms of character suggesting plot, then I just imagine the protagonist experiencing temptation, and then a situation starts to emerge to support that experience.
Right, and I don't remember if he had already kind of been on the road and met sort of these different fringe people and felt accepted. And I know some
Wasn't there something about him going back to, he was going to go back to school or something like that?
Something like that, yeah. And I think it was where, you know, he was going to be given a car and different things.
That's right. He was almost being maybe bribed in a way or something. Come back to the status quo. Right. And there was something about him that
didn't belong.
Rejected. Yeah. And on some level, it's a tragedy. What was heartbreaking about it was that it seems like I don't want to say that. Because you get the sense that he was really loved by his parents. It was such a beautiful movie because there was. It was almost like the parents misunderstood him, but at the same time deeply loved him. And it would have been a very different movie if the parents just simply were controlling. But you didn't get the sense they were controlling. You got the sense that there was some kind of not really understanding who you are, and we have your best interest at heart, and why can't you follow this path? There was something really emotionally sort of sophisticated about that film.
But is the desire to belong and to be connected, aren't those the same thing?
I think they're very close. I think belonging and acceptance and connection and truth and freedom, they're all sort of in the same ballpark. But when you start to investigate the structure questions, one of these words starts to bubble up to the top, and it's almost like a feeling tone. You start to recognize that, oh, wait a second, this story is about belonging from the very beginning to the very end, or this story is about connection. They're not exactly the same.
In the 90-day screenplay, the writer does not start writing the first drafts until 30 days have passed?
So the first 4 weeks are all about imagining the world of your story. We do a lot of stream of consciousness writing exercises. In fact, the first week, you don't even investigate structure. Because I really believe that the subconscious is the seat of your genius. So what you do is you just imagine your characters in relationship to other characters. Because the moment you start to explore plot, or the moment you want to start to put a frame around this story, we can get stuck. And so it's a process of going from the general to the specific. So imagining the world of the story, it's really just about asking questions and holding them loosely. Like, who is this character? How old are they? Where do they live? Who are they in relationship to? And quickly writing it down. I'll do it longhand, on a yellow legal pad. And as you start to allow the characters to exist in this world, it starts to lead to the structure questions, which happens really in the second week of the workshop. And that's what I mean by marrying the wildness of your imagination, which is just imagining the world without imposing structure, to the rigor of story structure, which is the experiential questions. And what happens, this is sort of non-linear narrative starts to emerge. And it's sort of like a Polaroid coming into focus. It's not chronological. It's not like this happens, then this happens, then this happens. It's more akin to this Polaroid where you can jump around and you can say, well, what might be the dark night of this? What is that decision your protagonist makes that they can't go back on? And what is that dark night of the soul? What is that moment of despair? What is that moment of temptation? And these experiences start to emerge. Or you do the transformation exercise. How is my protagonist relating differently to other characters at the end than they were at the beginning? And what do they understand at the end that they didn't understand at the beginning? And as you do that exercise repeatedly, what happens is it creates a goldmine of images for what precedes your ending. So let's say my protagonist she's hugging her mother at the end of the story. Well, I need to show where she's not getting along with her mother, so there's a context for the hug at the end, for example. So you're really just playing in the sandbox with these tools, and the story starts to emerge. Once you've done that for 4 weeks, that's when you write your first draft. Because if you were to come up with a premise and start writing your first draft on day one, you're writing your idea of your screenplay. You're not writing the truth of the screenplay. In fact, I just read an interview with Scott Frank, brilliant screenwriter, and he said he spends the first couple of months just sort of wandering around, wondering about the story, and being curious about what is that opening scene? How can I best introduce this character? And so the more you give yourself time to imagine the characters in relationship to each other, the more you're going to fill the well with images. So when you start writing your first draft, you're going to have a really dynamic narrative.
And so are the writers even contemplating who the protagonist is in the 30-day
Oh yeah,
period?
I mean from the beginning,
Yeah, okay.
I think, not always, but you don't always know who the protagonist is at the beginning, but frequently you have a sense of who your protagonist is. But if a writer said to me, I'm not sure who the protagonist is, I would say you don't need to know it right now. Let's explore the world of the story, explore the characters in relationship to each other, and the protagonist will start to emerge. Not a lot of writers, but frequently writers think they have multiple protagonists, and which is extremely rare. It's not impossible, but oftentimes what they think of as multiple protagonists is an ensemble where they've got multiple main characters. Protagonist is typically the character that has the biggest change by the end of the story, And what you discover is that even if you've got an ensemble, you can often hang the structure on this protagonist character.
After the 30 days have passed, what's the first step in writing the story?
Well, then we do the next 4 weeks. You write the first draft in sort of a modular fashion. So you spend a week writing your first act. You spend 2 weeks writing the second act because it's typically approximately twice the length of the first act. And then the fourth week is writing your third act. And you want to get it down quickly. You fill the well with images. An outline has emerged. You've got a sense of a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now let's get this thing down as fast as you can without rushing. And so a week is plenty of time to write 30 pages. There's not a lot of ink on the page in a screenplay. There's a lot of, so but what you don't want to do is you don't want to go back and rewrite your first draft. Just start to get it all down. And then in the final 5 weeks of the workshop is when we do the rewrite or the polish.
And so, as you have advised writers previously, don't tell friends, family, coworkers, etc., about your story idea. Are you also advising them not to speak to other students about it?
Well, in the workshop, that's why I call it the lab, where they're not talking to other students, but I am working one-on-one with the students. But the way I work is I ask a lot of questions. I'm just curious. And I've been doing this a long time, so I'm often asking leading questions, but I'm asking questions that are going to invite up images and ideas that are hopefully going to make the story as dynamic as it wants to be.
How should a writer outline their story?
How should a writer outline their story? Well, I think there's as many ways to outline it as there are writers. There are no rules in creating a story. We're making art. And so I think an outline is valuable, but every writer has a different sort of relationship to how specific they want their outline to be. Some writers want a really vague, sort of loose outline. Other writers require an extremely considered and concise outline before they can begin. And so it's only through the process of creating a story that you're gonna sort of find what feels right for you, and it's probably going to vary from one project to the next.
Okay, so there's not like the perfect sort of outline. You know, 24 plot points or different things. You whatever works for the writer. You suggest different styles.
Well, yeah, I do. The moment we approach art like it's long division, we're going to get stuck. We're going to get into our heads. So it's really, I think sometimes there comes a point, it's almost like you reach this, it's like a super saturation point where you can't contain the story any longer and it's just demanding to be written. And I think that's when you start to write it. But sometimes what happens is oftentimes, not oftentimes, but sometimes writers want to sort of prematurely jump into the first draft. And there's this real eagerness just to get started. And I'll say, if you really want to start writing your first draft, there aren't any rules. Go ahead and get started. But what if you just took a breath and just spent a few more days exploring the world of your story and allowing this outline to emerge? And often what happens is if they do that, they'll have a breakthrough. And they'll go, oh my God, I'm glad I didn't start writing yet, because I'm now understanding the story, and sometimes in some fundamental way that had I begun writing the story, I would have probably had more work to do in the rewrite process. So, you know, we're always looking for the path of least resistance. And I think that if you really give yourself some solid time to explore the world of your story, it's going to save you time in the long run, because if you have a solid outline, you're going to... the other thing about the outline is when you have a solid outline, you're far more inclined to have the confidence to stray from it. But if you don't have an outline, it can ironically you can start to get neurotic and controlling because I got to get this thing to work. But if you got the outline, I always tell my writers, if you know you're going to go left in a scene, you must go right. Meaning, if you know, I'll give you an example. So Billy says to Sally, will you marry me? And Sally says, yes, Billy, I'll marry you. Well, I just told you exactly what happened in the scene. It doesn't mean anything. If you saw that scene, you would go, what is happening? But if Billy says, Sally, will you marry me? And Sally says, yes, Billy, but only if you work for my father, the hitman. Now we know what the scene's about. Now Billy has a dilemma. He's in love with Sally, but he's required to be a hitman in order to have his heart's desire. Okay, so until we understand what the protagonist's dilemma is, meaning can't get conveyed.